A millionaire took a poor boy to his house for one night on Christmas Eve. At dawn, he was shocked to discover what he had done to his wife. The cold morning in a busy city seemed indifferent to the presence of Tobias, an 8-year-old boy with tattered clothes and bare feet. He walked the streets with his head down, clutching his rumbling, hungry stomach. The sidewalks were his home, and the little he had in his dirty, worn backpack were worthless items he had found in the trash. Tobias looked at the bakery and restaurant windows with hungry eyes, imagining the taste of fresh bread and hot meals he could never try. He held out his hand to some people who walked by in a hurry, but all he received were looks of disdain and inaudible murmurs. "Get out of here, dirty brat," yelled a shopkeeper when he saw him standing in front of his store, trying to warm up from the cold. Tobias took a step back, flinching at the man's rude tone. He didn't have the courage to answer. He just lowered his head and walked away, hearing laughter from other people who witnessed the scene. His eyes filled with tears, but he tried to hold back the crying. He didn't want to seem weaker than he already was. He walked to a nearby square, where other children played with warm clothes and toys he could only imagine having. Sitting on a wooden bench, Tobias saw a ball roll to his feet. He picked up the toy. His eyes lit up with a moment of joy, but when one of the rich children came to get the ball, the happiness was crushed. "Don't touch that with your dirty hands," the boy yelled, snatching the ball back. Others laughed and started pointing at Tobias, calling him stinky and thief. He remained silent, but inside he felt a mixture of shame and anger. All he wanted was a little kindness, but the world only seemed to know how to hurt him. As the day wore on, Tobias kept wandering the streets, hoping to find something he could eat. His stomach rumbled loudly, but the noise seemed invisible to those who passed by. He found a trash can in an alley, and despite his disgust, he began rummaging through the remains. The smell was terrible, and his hands trembled with cold as he dug through the torn, dirty bags. Some adults passing through the alley stopped to look, but not to help. "That's why the city is the way it is," said a man in a suit, shaking his head in disdain. "Street kids like him have no future." A woman carrying a bag full of groceries hurried her pace, as if she feared Tobias would attack her. "This kind of child only brings trouble," she commented to someone else, looking at him in disgust. Tobias heard but pretended not to care, even though the words cut him deep inside. He crouched even lower into the trash can, as if he wanted to disappear. Finally, he found a piece of old, hard bread covered in dirt. He cleaned it as best he could and began to eat. The taste was terrible, dry and rancid, but it was all he had. Each bite seemed to carry the weight of humiliation. Tired but still hungry, he left the alley and returned to the main streets where cars sped by and people hurried along. Tobias saw a man leaving a bakery with a bag full of hot, fresh bread. He mustered up courage and approached him, his eyes shining with hope. "Sir, can you give me a loaf of bread, please? I haven't eaten anything today." The man looked him up and down, wrinkling his nose. "Get out of here, kid." "I don't work to support you," he said, swinging the bag in front of Tobias before getting into his car. With no other choice, Tobias decided to try elsewhere. He entered a busy square where he saw people sitting on benches, eating and laughing. He approached a group of young people eating burgers and fries, smelling the delicious aroma that made his stomach ache even more. "Do you have any leftovers for me?" he asked in a trembling voice. One of the youngsters laughed loudly and replied, "Only if it's garbage," throwing a crumpled paper at him. Others started laughing, and Tobias quickly walked away, ashamed and with eyes full of tears. Later, he tried to get a cup of water from a public fountain in a park, but a guard saw him and kicked him out. "That water's not for lazy bums," the man yelled, pushing Tobias away. He fell to the ground, getting his tattered clothes even dirtier, while the guard threatened him with a baton. "If I catch you here again, you'll be sorry." As night fell, the cold began to increase, and Tobias knew he needed to find a place to sleep. He passed by a restaurant where the lights were shining and people were dining at elegant tables. He stood at the window for a few seconds, watching families laughing and sharing meals. His reflection in the glass reminded him of his condition. A waiter noticed his presence and came out to shoo him away. "Get out of here, boy. You're scaring the customers." Tobias lowered his head and ran off, not looking back. Finally, he found shelter under an awning. There were already other beggars there, some old, some young like him, but all with the same empty expression of those who no longer expect anything from life. He sat in a corner, huddling and hugging his knees to try to keep warm. The others ignored him, each dealing with their own misery. One man complained, "Get out of here, kid. This corner is mine." Tobias dragged himself to another side, trying to avoid more trouble. Lying on the cold ground, the noise of the city was still loud, but Tobias was too exhausted to care. The dark sky above seemed indifferent to his suffering, but he looked at the stars as if they were the only thing that could hear his silent plea. "I just wish tomorrow was different," he whispered, his voice almost fading into the cold wind. Hugging the emptiness, Tobias fell asleep as tears dried on his face. Deep down, he still dreamed of a world where someone cared about him. When the sun rose, Tobias awoke with the cold still penetrating his bones, even as the dawn brought a faint, warm glow. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the weariness, and slowly got up. The streets began to fill again with hurried people, honking cars and the noise of a city that never stopped. Tobias looked around, his stomach already growling with hunger, and decided he needed to try begging for money or food to survive one more day. He positioned himself on a busy corner where well-dressed men and women rushed past on their way to work. He extended his trembling hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and hope. "Miss, can you help me with something?" "Anything, please," he said to a lady carrying an expensive purse. The woman stopped for a moment, looked him up and down with a disgusted expression, and instead of answering, opened her purse and tossed an apple at him. "Here you go, kid." "Better than begging for money," she said before hurrying off. The apple, which fell to the ground and rolled to a stop in a puddle of dirty water, was enough to draw the attention of other pedestrians. Some began to laugh at the scene, while others cast disapproving looks. "These street kids are all the same," commented one man to another, both carrying leather briefcases. Tobias bent down to pick up the apple, but before he could reach it, someone kicked the fruit away. "You should work, boy, and not stand here bothering us." With tears in his eyes, Tobias moved away from there and tried another spot, near a bakery. There, the smell of fresh bread and coffee made his stomach ache even more. He approached a man leaving with a bag full of breads. "Please, sir, can you help me? Just one bread, just one." But before he could finish, the man spat on the ground near him, looking away as if Tobias wasn't even human. "Get out of here, kid. Go find another victim," the man said, continuing on his way without even hesitating. The rejection was constant, but Tobias tried not to give up. He approached a group of teenagers sitting in a square sharing snacks. "Do you have anything for me?" "I'm really hungry," he asked, his voice trembling. In response, one of the youths laughed loudly and grabbed a partially eaten sandwich. "Here you go, take it," he said, throwing the sandwich toward Tobias, who tried to catch it but missed, watching the sandwich fall to the ground. Another teenager spat on the ground near him, laughing. "You should be grateful, kid. It's more than you deserve." Humiliated, Tobias couldn't hold back the silent tears streaming down his face. He picked up the dirty sandwich, cleaned it as best he could, and took a bite. The taste of dirt mixed with the little filling that was left, but he was too hungry to care. Still, he couldn't finish eating. The looks from people around him, the laughter, the cruel words he heard throughout the day began to weigh too heavily on his small shoulders. He felt his heart tighten, and for the first time, he wished he could disappear. As the day progressed, the humiliations continued. Some people ignored him completely, looking away or pretending not to hear him. Others were more direct, like a taxi driver who, upon seeing him standing near a traffic light, yelled from inside the car, "Go to work, lazy bum!" Tobias tried to hold back his tears, but his voice trembled as he tried to explain himself. "I'm just a child," he mumbled, but no one seemed to care. By late afternoon, he was already exhausted, dirty, and his face stained with dried tears. He sat on the sidewalk of a less busy street, hugging his knees and looking at the people passing by, hoping that at least one of them could see him as something other than a nuisance. When a woman walked by carrying a bag full of fruit, he mustered the courage to speak again. "Please help me," he said, his voice low and hoarse. But the woman just shook her head, muttering, "Not my problem." Tobias stayed there for hours, trying to find some kindness in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. When night fell and the cold returned to the streets, he huddled under an awning, the same place he had slept the night before. His hands trembled, but he still tried to warm himself by hugging his own body. He looked up at the dark sky, and the stars seemed as distant as the help he so longed for. "Why doesn't anyone see me?" he whispered to himself, his voice almost fading into the sound of the wind. He fell asleep with that question echoing in his mind as silent tears rolled down his face. The next day, Tobias woke up earlier than usual. The cold morning enveloped him like a layer of ice, but something in his heart made him want to try again. He was hungry, a hunger that seemed to never go away. He walked through the busy streets, avoiding the looks he already knew would judge him, until he spotted a small corner restaurant. The smell of hot, fresh food made him stop for a few moments, his stomach growling loudly. He knew he would probably be kicked out, but his hunger was greater than his fear. Upon entering the restaurant, he felt the warmth of the place embrace him. It was simple, with wooden tables and walls decorated with photos of traditional dishes. The movement was intense, with customers speaking loudly and waiters running from one side to the other. Tobias kept his head down, trying not to draw attention as he slowly walked to the back of the hall. He looked at the tables, his eyes fixed on the plates full of rice, beans, meats, and breads that seemed as distant as the starry sky of the previous night. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" The waiter's voice echoed through the restaurant, drawing attention from a few people. Tobias froze, his breath becoming ragged, and he lowered his head even further. Before he could respond, an older man seated at one of the nearby tables stood up and approached the waiter. "Leave him to me," the man said, his tone firm but calm. The waiter hesitated for a moment, but noticing the assurance in the man's words, he shrugged and went back to work. The graying, gentle-looking man looked at Tobias and leaned in slightly. "You're hungry, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low so as not to draw attention. Tobias simply nodded, his eyes glistening with shame and relief. The man looked around, making sure no one was watching them, and motioned for the boy to follow him. Tobias obeyed quickly, feeling that for the first time in days someone was willing to help him. They passed through a back door of the restaurant, which led to a small storage area. It was a cramped place, filled with shelves of rice bags, boxes of spices, and canned goods. The man pointed to a corner where there was a small stool. "Stay here. No one comes to this part except me," he said, as he grabbed a bag of bread and a bottle of water from one of the shelves. He handed the items to Tobias, who took them with trembling hands. "Eat slowly," the man said. "I'll get you something better in a moment." Tobias began eating the bread almost immediately, biting into it carefully but with a ravenous appetite. With each piece he chewed, he felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. Why was this man helping him? He wasn't used to acts of kindness. As he ate, the man returned with a plate of simple but hot food, rice, beans, and a small portion of meat. Tobias looked at the plate as if it were a treasure, tears beginning to roll down his face. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice choked. "You don't need to thank me," the man said, sitting on a nearby crate. "You shouldn't be living like this, kid. Where are your parents?" Tobias lowered his eyes, poking at the food with the spoon the man had given him. "I don't have anyone," he replied, his voice almost fading. "Just me, and no one cares." The man sighed, crossing his arms. "Well, you have someone who cares now," he said firmly. "You can stay here for a while, but you have to be discreet. The restaurant owner doesn't like outsiders back here." Tobias nodded quickly, still chewing the food. That small promise of safety was more than he expected to find that day. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope spark within him, even if he didn't know how long it would last. As the man went back to the main dining area, Tobias remained in the small storage room, finishing his meal. He looked at the empty plate with a shy smile, a rare sight on his face. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't completely indifferent to him. Days passed, and Tobias realized that the man was a janitor at the restaurant and began to feel more secure in that small storage room. Although the space was cramped and full of boxes and bags, to him it was like a sanctuary. Each day the man who had helped him would bring food and water, always with a smile on his face and a comforting word. Tobias still didn't know his name, but he felt he could trust this kind figure. The man would talk to him during breaks, asking about his life, his dreams, and even trying to coax a few laughs out of the boy. It was a brief respite amidst the harshness of the reality he faced. In the days Tobias spent hidden in the restaurant's storage room, he began to notice the constant tension in the man who was helping him. The man who worked as a janitor did his best to keep Tobias safe, but with every step he took across the dining room or every time he grabbed food from the kitchen, he would look over his shoulder, afraid of being discovered. He was a simple man, with graying hair and calloused hands, clearly accustomed to hard work and daily struggles. Still, he dedicated what little he had to offer Tobias some comfort. This fear that haunted him came to fruition on a busy afternoon. The restaurant's owner, a burly man with a reddened face and booming voice, barged into the storage room. "What's going on here?" he bellowed, his voice reverberating through the small space. Tobias, who was sitting in a corner with a piece of bread in his hand, froze. He knew this could mean the end of his little sanctuary. The janitor, who had just arrived with another plate of food for Tobias, immediately placed himself between the boy and the owner. "I was just helping, sir," the janitor said, trying to remain calm, but his voice was already trembling. "The kid has nowhere to go, he's hungry, and I just wanted to give him a place to rest." The restaurant owner looked at him in disbelief, and then at Tobias, who shrank further into the corner. "Helping? You think this is what, a charity shelter?" "It's a restaurant. My customers come through here and you bring in some street kid. Do you have any idea what that could do to my reputation?" He pointed at Tobias with disdain, his face growing redder with every word. "Get him out of here now, or you're out too." Tobias, hearing those words, began to cry silently, hugging his knees as he felt the fear of returning to the streets tighten his chest. The janitor stepped forward, trying to argue again. "Sir, he's just a boy. He has no one for him. He's hungry, cold, not hurting anyone. I take full responsibility. Just let him stay for a little longer," he begged, his voice laden with despair. But the owner didn't give in. "I won't support beggars. This boy is not my problem, nor yours, and if you think you can disobey me, consider yourself fired," he shouted, banging his hand against the door with force, as if to emphasize his authority. The tension in the atmosphere was almost palpable, and Tobias felt his heart race, seeing the man who had helped him being treated that way. The owner's words were a blow that the janitor seemed unable to bear. He tried to speak again, but his breathing began to fail. He brought his hand to his chest, his eyes wide with pain, as he staggered backwards. Tobias watched the scene in horror, not knowing what to do. "No," the man whispered, before falling to the ground with a dull thud. Tobias screamed, running to him, "Sir, please, don't leave me." He shook the kind man, who remained motionless as tears streamed down the boy's face. The restaurant owner stood still for a few moments, shocked, but his expression soon became a mixture of irritation and concern. He picked up the phone, mumbling as he dialed for emergency. "This is your problem now, boy," he muttered, leaving the warehouse as if the situation didn't involve him. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed like a cruel reminder of the world's indifference. Tobias held the janitor's hand, desperate. "You were the only one who helped me. Please don't leave me alone now, will you?" His voice trembled, full of fear and sadness. He kept talking, as if his words could wake him up, as the distant sound of ambulance sirens began to fill the street. The wait seemed endless, and Tobias, with a broken heart, could only think that the only gesture of kindness he had received was about to be torn away from him. The ambulance sirens finally arrived at the restaurant, breaking the tense silence of the warehouse. Tobias, still holding the janitor's hand, looked at him with tears in his eyes. "You need to be okay. Please don't leave me," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. When the paramedics entered the site, they quickly pushed Tobias aside to try to assist the man. The boy, hesitant, took a few steps back, but didn't take his eyes off the only adult who had shown kindness to him. The paramedics began to work frantically, checking for vital signs and trying to resuscitate him. "Very weak pulse," one of them commented. The expression on the professional's faces quickly turned grim, and Tobias realized that something was terribly wrong. He took a step forward, wanting to help, but before he could approach, the restaurant owner appeared behind him with an angry expression. "That's enough," the owner shouted, grabbing Tobias's arm with force. "You've caused enough trouble for today, brat." The boy tried to resist, but he was too small and weak to escape. Before he could say anything, the owner dragged him out of the restaurant, violently opening the door and pushing him onto the sidewalk. Tobias tripped and fell to the ground, the impact hurting his knee and hands, which were now scraped and bleeding. "I told you this is not a charity shelter," the owner roared, pointing at the boy as he looked at him with contempt. And if you come back here, I'll call the police, understood? With that, he slammed the door hard, isolating Tobias from the last person who had shown him compassion. The boy sat on the sidewalk, holding his knees and trying to hold back his tears. The physical pain of his wounds was minor compared to the pain he felt in his heart. He looked at the restaurant's entrance where the paramedics were still working on the man who had helped him. Tobias hoped he would come out of there alive, that he could smile at him one more time, tell him that everything would be okay. However, minutes later, the paramedics stopped. One of them shook his head while another covered the man's body with a white sheet. Tobias understood what that meant, even though he didn't want to believe it. The man who had helped him, who had shared food and shown kindness when no one else did, had passed away. He was gone, and Tobias was alone in the world again. The tears began to stream down Tobias's face, but he didn't cry loudly. He just sobbed softly, trying to process what had happened. He wanted to run to the ambulance but didn't know if he had the strength to move. Sitting on the cold floor, with his hands hurt and his knee aching, he felt the emptiness grow inside him. The only person who had reached out to him, who had shown that there might still be kindness in the world, was now just a memory. The ambulance left, taking the body of the man who had been Tobias's only source of comfort in recent days. He stayed there alone, watching the flashing lights disappear over the horizon. Looking up at the sky, Tobias whispered, his voice full of sadness, "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did for me." And then, with nowhere to go, he began to walk, each step heavier than the last, with the certainty that the world had become an even colder place. Hurt and with nowhere to go, Tobias wandered the streets, but his steps always led him back to the restaurant. He knew he wasn't welcome there, but he couldn't avoid it. That small storage room, where he had experienced a gesture of kindness for the first time in a long while, had now become a place of memory. Even with his knee still sore and his hands hurt, he sat across the street, hidden in a discreet corner, just to observe from afar the place where John, the janitor who had helped him, had worked and sacrificed for him. Every day he stayed there, imagining John's gentle face and the comforting words he had received. "You're just a boy. Nobody should live like this." Tobias remembered the times when John had told him that. He held back tears as he looked at the restaurant, now with an emptiness that seemed overwhelming. It was hard to accept that the single spark of kindness he had found in the world had gone out. One afternoon, while Tobias was hidden behind a pile of boxes across the street, he heard the loud voice of the restaurant owner coming from inside. The door was partially open, and he silently approached, curious, but also afraid. The owner was talking to one of his employees, gesturing angrily. "John, that old idiot," the man said, slamming his hand on the counter with contempt. "He stuck his nose where he shouldn't have, and now he's dead. And you know what? Let him go with God or wherever he deserves, because here he only gave me problems." The owner's words felt like a punch in Tobias's stomach. He shrank further behind the boxes, trying to control the tears that silently streamed down his face. The cruel and disrespectful tone of the owner made his heart ache. John, who had been so kind, so generous, was being treated with total contempt by someone who didn't seem to have a shred of humanity. "And he even left me at a loss," the owner continued, laughing ironically. "Now I have to find another janitor because he thought he was a saint. Frankly, who did he think he was to help that street kid?" Another employee tried to argue. "But sir, John was a good man. He always did his job and never caused any trouble. He was just trying to help." Before he could finish, the owner interrupted him. "A good man? A good man doesn't meddle in things that aren't his business. He was stupid, that's all. So now enough talking about him. I don't want to hear that guy's name anymore. We have work to do." Outside, Tobias clenched his fists, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. How could someone speak like that about a person who had given everything, even his own life, for another? He wanted to shout, to confront the owner, but he knew he didn't have the strength or voice to do it. All he could do was swallow the lump in his throat and return to his hidden corner. While the sun began to set, Tobias looked once more at the restaurant. At that moment, he promised himself that he would never forget John. Even if the world seemed indifferent, even if no one else cared, Tobias would always carry the memory of the man who, for a brief moment, showed him that kindness still existed. Sitting on the sidewalk, he murmured to himself, "I will remember you, John, always." And so, even hurt, alone, and not knowing what the future held, Tobias kept coming back to that place every day, not out of hope, but to honor the memory of the only friend he had ever had. The next day, Tobias, his knees still sore and hands scraped, once again made his way to the restaurant. It was as if something pulled him there, a mixture of longing for John and a need to connect with the memories of the man who had been kind to him. He hid in the same corner as always, behind a pile of boxes across the street, and watched. The routine of the restaurant seemed the same, but suddenly something caught his attention. A thin, barefoot girl was standing near the restaurant's entrance. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face marked by the dust of the streets. Tobias immediately recognized that expression of hunger mixed with fear. It was the same one he carried every day. The girl reached out to a waiter coming out the door, but before she could say anything, the restaurant owner appeared. Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" he shouted, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. The girl took a step back, startled, but tried to speak. "Please, sir, I just wanted a piece of bread. I'm very hungry." The owner let out a dry, cruel laugh. "Bread? Do you think this is what, a free buffet? Isn't it enough that these street kids keep bothering me day and night? Now you show up too. I don't have time to take care of trash like you." He crossed his arms, leaning slightly toward the girl as if to intimidate her further. The girl, her eyes filled with tears, tried to explain. "I have no one. I'm just hungry." "Serge, of course, always the same story," the owner interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No one, no home, no food, and who has to solve that? Me? Let me tell you something. Your hunger is not my problem, understood? If you want food, go look in the trash because you're not going to get anything here." Those words cut Tobias like a knife. He knew exactly how the girl felt, each cruel word from the owner echoing like the ones he himself had heard. But the owner didn't stop there. "Look at you," he continued with a bitter laugh. "You don't even look like a person. Do you think anyone's going to care about filth like you? You're just bothering my customers by being here. So do us all a favor and disappear." The girl began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking as she took hesitant steps back. "Disappear," the owner repeated, slamming the door shut soon after. Tobias, hidden, felt his chest tighten with indignation and sadness. He wanted to do something to help that girl the way John had helped him. But he was just a boy, alone, hurt, and without resources. He knew he couldn't stand up to the owner, not yet. He watched as the crying girl slowly walked away, rubbing her eyes as she went down the street. Tobias felt tears well up in his own eyes. The world seemed so cruel, so indifferent to the pain of the most vulnerable. He clenched his fists, the owner's words still echoing in his mind. "I'm not trash," he murmured to himself, as if trying to convince not only himself, but the world. In that moment, he vowed that one day he would do something to change the way he and others like him were treated. Tobias knew that owner could have all the money and power in the world, but he would never have what John had: humanity. As Christmas neared, Tobias continued to watch the restaurant from afar, always hidden in his corner. He knew he wasn't welcome there, but he still felt he needed to be near that place where John, the only adult who had been kind to him, had worked and sacrificed himself. However, something began to change at the restaurant as the end-of-year holidays drew closer. The windows were decorated with twinkling lights, garlands, and posters announcing special Christmas dinners. Suddenly, the place exuded a festive air that contrasted with the coldness Tobias always felt when passing by. More intriguing than the decorations was the shift in the owner's attitude. Once known for his cruelty and explosive temper, he began to display a completely different behavior. Tobias saw him step out of the restaurant and hand out small portions of food to some people passing by. "May the Christmas spirit touch everyone," he would say, with a smile so wide it seemed forced. A group of bystanders would applaud and comment on the restaurant's generosity. From his hideout, Tobias narrowed his eyes. He knew that wasn't genuine. He had seen the true face of that man, the way he treated the more vulnerable, how he despised anyone who couldn't pay for what he offered. Still, the trick worked. More and more people entered the restaurant, attracted by the image of the restaurant that helped those in need. One afternoon, as he watched, Tobias saw the owner step out onto the sidewalk with a large basket full of bread. He distributed some to passers-by, while a photographer took several photos of him posing. "It's important to help the less fortunate, especially at this time of year," he said, in a melodious, almost theatrical voice. After the photographer left, Tobias saw the owner put the basket back into the restaurant, without distributing anything else, and mutter something like, "That should be enough to attract more people." The next day, posters were placed in the restaurant's windows, showing photos of the owner distributing food with phrases like, "Sharing the Christmas spirit with the community," and "Come be part of this gesture of love and solidarity." People praised the restaurant, commenting on how the owner was an example to be followed. Tobias, hidden, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He knew it was all a sham, but no one else seemed to notice. Inside the restaurant, the owner's behavior remained the same as always. Tobias, still vigilant, saw when he yelled at one of the waiters for not cleaning a table quickly enough and kicked a chair in frustration. And yet, when he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the fake smile immediately returned, accompanied by sweet words for any potential customer. Meanwhile, Tobias remained hidden, observing the cruel irony of that man who pretended to be a hero while humiliating the weaker ones behind closed doors. The boy clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness grow inside him. Christmas, which should be a time of genuine kindness and generosity, was being used by the owner merely as a spectacle to attract more customers and fill his pockets even more. John would never do that, thought Tobias, his eyes welling up. He knew the janitor who had saved him was the true definition of kindness, not that man who used the holidays to mask his cruelty. As he watched the owner show off once more, Tobias whispered to himself, "I won't forget what he did or who you really are." As the restaurant's traffic increased as Christmas approached, Tobias continued watching from afar, hungry and cold. He saw the owner come out again with the bread basket, distributing with exaggerated displays of generosity to passers-by, surrounded by smiles and applause. The Christmas lights blinked around the entrance, and people seemed to believe the facade of kindness from that man. The smell of fresh bread reached where Tobias was, and his stomach rumbled loudly. He knew it was risky, but hunger spoke louder. Approaching slowly, Tobias waited for a moment when the owner was distracted talking to customers. He mingled among the people waiting for a piece of bread. When he finally stood in front of the basket, he hesitantly extended his hand, trying to grab a loaf without drawing attention. But the owner saw him immediately. "Hey, you again?" the man shouted, his loud voice drawing everyone's attention around. Tobias froze, holding the bread with a trembling hand, unsure whether to run or try to explain. The owner advanced towards him, snatching the bread from his hands with force. "You think you can just show up here and take whatever you want? This isn't for lazybones like you." The people around began to whisper, and some backed away, shocked by the man's tone. Tobias, embarrassed, lowered his head, but the owner didn't stop. He pointed at the boy with a look of contempt. "This kid is always around here, disrupting my work, scaring my customers. He must think that just because it's Christmas, I'm obligated to feed him. Well, let me tell you something, boy. If you have nothing in life, it's your fault, not mine." Some customers tried to intervene. "He's just a child," muttered a woman, but the owner immediately cut her off. "Oh, sure, a child who does nothing but steal and beg. These kids are a burden on society. If we keep helping them, they'll never learn." Tobias felt the tears burn his eyes but tried to hold back his crying. He wanted to disappear, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. The owner continued, "Aren't you ashamed? At your age, you should be studying or working, not asking for food. But that's what you do, isn't it? Always expecting someone else to do everything for you." With his face flushed with humiliation, Tobias finally took a few steps back, stumbling and almost falling. I was just hungry," he mumbled, his voice weak and trembling. But the owner laughed, loud and cruel. "Hungry? Then go look in the trash where you belong. There's no place for parasites here." The man's words were like stabs in Tobias's heart, and he turned and began to run, the tears finally streaming down his face. The people around watched, some shocked, others just shaking their heads in silence. The owner in turn went back inside with a fake smile on his face, as if nothing had happened. Tobias ran until he found a dark, isolated corner where he curled up, hugging his own knees. He sobbed softly, trying to understand how the world could be so cruel. "I just wanted a piece of bread," he whispered to himself, his voice almost inaudible. Once again he felt the pain of being completely alone in a world that didn't seem to care. With a heavy heart and bitter memories of his last attempts at survival, Tobias made a difficult decision. He would never return to the restaurant again. Every time he approached that place, he felt his dignity being torn away piece by piece. He could no longer endure the looks of disdain, the cruel words, and the constant humiliation. On that cold morning, as the streets began to adorn themselves with Christmas decorations, he decided to leave. "Maybe somewhere else I'll have better luck," he mumbled to himself, trying to muster the little courage he had left. With no clear destination, Tobias walked to the bus station. He knew he didn't have money to pay for the fare, but hunger and despair made him take the risk. Hiding behind a group of distracted passengers, he managed to board one of the buses departing for a nearby town. He sat in the back, trying not to draw attention, as the vehicle swayed on the pothole-ridden roads. The warmth of the bus provided temporary relief, but his empty stomach and fear of being discovered left him restless. The driver cast a suspicious glance through the rearview mirror a few times, but was too busy with traffic to pay closer attention. When the bus stopped at its destination, Tobias quickly got off, blending into the crowd. He looked around. The new town was larger and busier, with streets decorated for Christmas and illuminated stores displaying window displays full of gifts. However, this festive scene only made him feel even more out of place. As families strolled laughing and children carried bags of toys, Tobias walked alone, trying to ignore the pangs of hunger that seemed to consume his body. He tried to beg for money on the main streets, but people rushed past, ignoring his pleas. "Please, sir, just a coin," he said to an elegantly dressed man carrying a bag full of presents. The man ignored him completely, as if he didn't exist. A woman carrying a Christmas cake stopped for a moment, looked at him, but soon shook her head and moved on. "These street kids never learn," she muttered to someone else, unaware that Tobias had overheard. The day passed slowly, and Tobias began to feel the weight of fatigue and loneliness. He found an isolated corner in a park where he sat, hugging his own knees to protect himself from the growing cold. It was Christmas Eve, and the twinkling lights in the distance only made his reality harsher. The sound of Christmas carols echoed through the streets, but for him, every melody seemed to mock his situation. Families passed by laughing. Children played with Santa hats, and the aroma of delicious foods floated in the air, but none of it belonged to him. As the sky darkened, Tobias tried to warm himself with a piece of cardboard he found discarded in the park. His stomach ached so badly that he could barely think of anything else. "Is this what life will be forever?" he thought, as tears silently rolled down his face. He looked up at the starry sky and made a small wish, his voice soft and fragile. "If someone can hear me, I just wanted a little food. I just wanted not to be alone today." The night wore on, and the cold became almost unbearable. Tobias, shivering and exhausted, began to fall asleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he felt afraid he might never wake up. He wondered if anyone, anywhere, thought of him or cared. Deep down, he still carried a small hope that something could change, but in that moment everything seemed distant and impossible. As the surrounding city celebrated Christmas, Tobias was alone, hungry, and fighting despair. As the night progressed, Tobias wandered through the city's illuminated streets. Every window he passed seemed to display a scene of happiness he had never experienced. Families gathered around bountiful tables, laughing and conversing. Children unwrapping presents with hopeful looks, decorated Christmas trees shining with colorful ornaments. He would stop for a few moments to watch, hidden in the shadows, feeling his heart tighten more and more. He couldn't help the silent tears that streamed down his face as he imagined what it would be like to be inside one of those houses, part of a family, feeling loved and secure. "Why do they have all this, and I have nothing?" he murmured to himself, his voice almost disappearing into the cold air. The cold seemed more intense and his stomach growled loudly, but what hurt most was the loneliness. He leaned against a lamppost and looked up at the starry sky, trying to find some comfort in the stars. But the sadness consumed him. "Maybe I don't belong in this world," he thought, hugging his knees to try to warm himself. Suddenly, a deep, gentle voice caught his attention. "Hey, boy!" Tobias looked up, startled, and saw a man standing on the sidewalk. He was tall, with graying hair and a weathered face, but his eyes had a softness Tobias hadn't seen in a long time. The man carried a bag of fruit and a gift box under his arm. "What are you doing out here alone? It's Christmas Eve. You should be with your family." Tobias hesitated, looking at the man with distrust. "I don't have anyone," he replied, lowering his eyes. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but laden with a pain the man seemed to understand. The man looked at him for a moment in silence and then took a step closer. "It's too cold for you to be out here. Come with me. I can't offer much, but my house has a warm soup and a couch where you can rest tonight." Tobias looked at him, surprised. No one had ever offered him something like that before. He wanted to refuse, afraid it was just another trap. But the man's tone seemed so sincere that he eventually got up slowly without saying a word. As they walked along the streets lit by Christmas decorations, Theodore tried to create a more welcoming environment for the child walking by his side. He looked at Tobias, who remained silent, his shoulders hunched and his head down. "My name is Theodore," he said with a gentle smile. "I live nearby with my wife, Luna. We have plenty of room, and at this time of year, no one should be alone." Tobias raised his eyes to the man, still distrustful but intrigued. It was hard to understand why someone so well-dressed and clearly from a higher social class would care about him. When they reached the house, Tobias stopped for a moment, impressed. The elegantly decorated mansion, with Christmas lights and an illuminated tree in the garden, seemed to have come straight out of a fairy tale. Theodore opened the automatic gate with a touch of the control and invited him in. As soon as they entered, the warmth of the house enveloped Tobias like an embrace. The foyer was spacious, with a chandelier shining on the ceiling and furniture exuding luxury. However, what caught the boy's attention most was the figure of a woman who appeared in the living room. Luna, Theodore's wife, was a woman with a sweet appearance, with wavy brown hair and welcoming eyes. She seemed surprised to see Tobias's small figure beside her husband. "Who is this, Theodore?" Luna asked, walking towards them. Tobias took a step back, nervous, but Theodore placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's Tobias," Theodore explained with the same calm voice. "I found him alone on the street. He's going to spend the night with us. He needs warmth and food, and we can't leave him like that on Christmas Eve." Luna looked at Tobias with compassion, a soft smile appearing on her lips. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "Come here, dear. I'll get you something warm to eat." Tobias followed Luna to the kitchen while Theodore stepped away to make a quick phone call. The kitchen was large, with marble countertops and shiny cabinets. Luna set a bowl of soup on the table and brought a piece of fresh bread. "Here you go, Tobias," she said, pointing to the chair. "Eat up, I know you must be starving." The boy sat down, still a little shy, but the smell of the soup was irresistible. He picked up the spoon with trembling hands and took the first bite. The warm, rich flavor seemed to melt the cold he carried in his body and heart. "Thank you," he mumbled without raising his eyes. As he ate, Luna sat down beside him, watching him tenderly. "Do you have a family, Tobias?" she asked, her voice low and gentle. The boy shook his head, trying to hold back tears. "No, it's just me," he answered, his voice cracked with sadness. Luna gently touched his hand in a gesture of comfort. "Well, today you're part of our family. Is that okay?" Theodore returned to the room shortly after, bringing a soft blanket. "You can sleep on the living room sofa tonight," he said, pointing to the cozy space with pillows and blankets. "Tomorrow we can talk and see what to do next." When Tobias finished eating, Luna accompanied him to the sofa and helped him get settled. He clutched the blanket tightly, as if it were a treasure. Before they turned off the lights, Theodore approached him one more time. "Good night, Tobias. You're safe here." The boy looked at him, his eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you for everything." It was the last thing he said before closing his eyes, the warmth of the house and Theodore and Luna's kindness finally allowing him to relax. For the first time in a long while, he fell asleep without fear, feeling that even if only for one night he belonged somewhere. Theodore and Luna stayed in the room for a few minutes, watching Tobias sleep. "He's so small, Theodore," Luna said, her voice full of emotion. "We can't let him go back to the streets." Theodore nodded, his eyes fixed on the boy. "I know," he replied. "He deserves a chance. And maybe, this Christmas, we can give him that." That night, the silence of the house was filled with a peace they hadn't felt in a long time. Even without knowing what the future would bring, Theodore and Luna were determined to do their best to ensure that Tobias would never again have to face the cold and loneliness alone. That same night, as the cozy silence of the house filled the air, Luna appeared in the living room with a smile on her face, carrying a large, colorful box. Theodore followed right behind, carrying a smaller box filled with shiny ornaments. Tobias, still wrapped in the blanket on the sofa, looked at them with curiosity. "Since we're all here together, how about we set up a Christmas tree?" Luna suggested, setting the box down on the floor. Tobias looked up, surprised, but a faint glimmer began to appear in his eyes. He had never set up a Christmas tree before. To him, that was something that only existed in store windows and in the homes of the happy people he saw through the windows. I can help," he asked, almost afraid of the answer. "Of course," Theodore replied enthusiastically. "That's why we're bringing all this here. We'll need a lot of help to make this tree shine." Tobias, still a little hesitant, got up from the sofa and approached slowly. Luna took an unassembled artificial tree out of the box and began arranging the parts on the floor. "Why don't you help me put the base together?" she said, handing the first pieces to Tobias. The boy held the parts carefully as if they were fragile and began fitting them together, following Luna's instructions. Theodore put on some soft Christmas music in the background as they worked together to erect the tree. "You know," he began as he helped Tobias attach the branches, "when I was little, setting up the Christmas tree was the best part of the year. My mom used to say that each ornament had to be hung with a wish for something good for the next year." Tobias looked at Theodore, interested. "Did you do that every year?" he asked, holding one of the branches. "Every year," Theodore replied, smiling. "And you know what I learned? It doesn't matter how big the tree or the ornaments are. What matters is who you set it up with." As the tree took shape, Luna began taking the ornaments out of the other box. There were shiny balls, stars, bells, and small colored lights. Tobias looked at everything with wide eyes, enchanted by the sparkle and colors. "Now comes the fun part," Luna said, handing Tobias a silver ball. "You can start hanging this one wherever you want." With a shy smile, Tobias took the ornament and carefully hung it on one of the branches. He looked at Luna, as if seeking approval, and she nodded enthusiastically. "It's perfect," she said, excited. Little by little, Tobias loosened up. He began taking the ornaments directly from the box, choosing where to place them, while Luna and Theodore encouraged him. The lights were carefully wrapped around the tree, and Theodore climbed a small stool to place the golden star on top. "There," he said, stepping down and looking at the tree with a satisfied smile. "I think it's perfect." Tobias looked at the fully decorated tree, with the lights blinking softly, and felt something new: happiness. He didn't know how to describe it, but his heart seemed lighter, as if for a moment he could forget all the bad things he had been through. "It's the most beautiful tree I've ever seen," he said, with a sincere smile. Luna knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. "That's because you helped put it together," she said tenderly. "Now, this tree is ours, and you know what that means? That this Christmas is yours too, Tobias." Theodore lit the fireplace, and the three sat together on the couch admiring the tree they had assembled. Luna brought cups of hot chocolate, and Tobias held his carefully, still marveling at the kindness he was receiving. As Christmas music played in the background, he felt at home for the first time in a long time. Before going to sleep, Tobias looked at the tree one more time, with the colored lights softly illuminating the room. He closed his eyes and made a small silent wish, thanking for that night he would never forget. Even though he didn't know what the future held, at that moment he felt safe, loved, and above all, happy. That night, after the tree was perfectly assembled and the Christmas atmosphere filled every corner of the house, Theodore began organizing the rooms so everyone could rest. He looked at Luna, who was pensive as she arranged some blankets in the living room. "Is everything okay?" he asked, frowning as he noticed she seemed worried. Luna hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, it's okay. I just don't think I'll sleep in our room today. That crack in the ceiling makes me uncomfortable," she said, avoiding her husband's gaze. Theodore, although confused, decided not to insist. He knew Luna had always been cautious about things related to the structure of the house. "If that makes you more comfortable, okay?" he replied with an understanding smile. "You can sleep in the guest room next door. Everything is in order there." Tobias, who had been silently observing the interaction, heard the conversation and became restless. He didn't want to cause more trouble for these people who had been so kind to him. "I can sleep in the living room, it's no problem," he said softly, looking at the floor. Theodore immediately shook his head. "Nothing of the sort, Tobias. You're going to sleep in the other guest room next to Luna's. It's a cozy place and perfect for you. Besides, you deserve a good night's rest after everything." Luna crouched down to be at the boy's level and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, dear. There's plenty of room in this house, and we want you to feel comfortable. Now go rest, and tomorrow we'll see what the day has in store for us." Tobias nodded, still shy, and followed Theodore to the room they had prepared for him. When the door was opened, he was impressed by the space. A soft bed, clean blankets, and a small lamp that softly illuminated the environment. It was more than he could have imagined for himself. "It's perfect," he said with a discreet smile. Theodore smiled back. "Get some rest, Tobias. We're right next door if you need anything." As Tobias lay down, he could hear the faint sound of Luna's footsteps in the room next door. Knowing that he was not alone in that house, even if in separate rooms, gave him a sense of security he had not felt in a long time. Luna, however, remained restless. Sitting on the bed, she looked at the wall that divided her room from Theodore's and sighed, as if there were something she preferred not to explain. Theodore, in his own room, also noticed Luna's absence by his side. He thought for a moment about the crack she had mentioned. It was indeed a valid reason, but Luna seemed more hesitant than usual. "Maybe it's just tiredness," he muttered to himself before turning off the lights. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Tobias was snuggled under the warm blankets, looking up at the ceiling and thinking about the kindness he had received that day. For the first time, he did not feel completely abandoned. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft sound of the wind outside, and fell asleep with a faint smile on his face. Despite being in separate rooms, the house was enveloped in a rare peace that night. It was as if, for a brief moment, each of them had found what they needed. Tobias, a safe place; Luna, distance from something that bothered her; and Theodore, the satisfaction of helping someone who desperately needed a home. In the middle of the night, Theodore woke up to a strange sound that seemed to come from the hallway. The silence of the house, which had once seemed welcoming, now carried a tension he could not explain. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the dimness of the room, while his ears picked up the rhythmic, faint sound of footsteps. It was almost imperceptible, but enough to fully awaken him. He remained lying down for a few seconds, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination or the natural creaking of an old house. But then, the sound repeated, discreet but deliberate steps, walking down the hallway. His heart began to beat faster, and he felt a chill run up his spine. Carefully, Theodore got up, trying not to make any noise. The floor under his feet was cold, and the early morning air seemed colder than usual. He walked to the bedroom door and opened it slowly, just enough to peek into the hallway. The dim light coming from a lamp in the living room cast elongated shadows dancing on the walls. For a moment he saw nothing, but then something caught his attention, a small figure moving slowly. It was Tobias. Theodore watched the boy walk with cautious steps, almost as if trying not to be heard. Tobias seemed nervous, his shoulders hunched and his head down, as if carrying an invisible weight. He was heading towards Luna's room, his movements slow and calculated. Theodore frowned, a strange feeling of confusion and concern forming in his mind. What could Tobias be doing there in the middle of the night? The man stood still for a moment, his hand still holding the half-open door. He considered calling the boy or asking what was going on, but something made him hesitate. Curiosity and a sense of alertness prevented him from acting immediately. He decided to wait and observe, trying to understand what motivated such behavior. Tobias in turn stopped in front of Luna's door. Theodore noticed that the boy was breathing faster, his chest visibly rising and falling. He seemed to hesitate, as if trying to decide whether or not to enter the room. The silence in the hallway was almost suffocating, interrupted only by the faint creaking of the floor under Tobias's bare feet. The tension in the air was palpable, and Theodore felt his own heart race as he watched the scene. Theodore leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the boy. What could be going through Tobias's mind? Why was he there, standing in front of Luna's door in the middle of the night? The boy's expression was difficult to decipher, but something in his behavior seemed charged with emotion, perhaps fear, perhaps determination. Theodore gripped the door tighter, the cold wood against his fingers, as he continued to wait, motionless, as if any movement from him could shatter that strange moment. The hallway remained enveloped in a heavy silence, and Theodore felt the tension growing with every second. He struggled against the urge to intervene, choosing to observe a little longer. Something about that situation seemed wrong, but he could not identify exactly what. Meanwhile, Tobias remained there, motionless in front of Luna's door, his small body trembling slightly as if facing an internal battle. Theodore narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what was happening, but the mystery only seemed to deepen. While Theodore watched attentively, Tobias remained motionless in front of Luna's door for a few seconds that seemed eternal. The boy seemed to be debating with himself, his small shoulders hunched and his hands trembling slightly. Theodore squeezed the half-open door even tighter, the cold from the hallway invading the room as his mind raced with unanswered questions. Why was Tobias there? What did he want in the middle of the night entering Luna's room? Suddenly, Tobias reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The soft sound of the mechanism echoed down the silent hallway, and Theodore held his breath. He hoped Luna would wake up, but the room remained dark and quiet. Tobias opened the door slowly, just enough to slip inside, and then closed it behind him, disappearing from Theodore's view. Theodore's heart raced, and apprehension took over his body. He felt a strange chill run down his spine as he stood still, unsure of what to do. The tension in the air seemed almost palpable, and he wondered if he should intervene immediately or wait a little longer. Why would Tobias enter Luna's room in the middle of the night? It made no sense, but Theodore tried to dismiss alarming thoughts, telling himself that the boy was just a frightened child. However, as the minutes ticked by and the silence in the hallway persisted, Theodore's uneasiness only grew. Something seemed out of place, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that he needed to act. Finally, taking a deep breath, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. Pushing his own bedroom door, he entered the hallway and began walking towards Luna's room, each step increasing his apprehension. As Theodore approached Luna's slightly ajar bedroom door, his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He paused for a moment, hesitating before raising his hand to push the door open. Inside, the darkness seemed heavier than usual, and the absolute silence left him with an unsettling feeling that something was about to happen. With his hand resting on the cold wood of the door, Theodore took a deep breath and began to slowly push it open, his anxiety growing with each passing second. Theodore pushed the door slowly, but even before fully entering, the muffled sound of choking and labored breathing reached his ears. He froze for an instant, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally opened the door completely, what he saw made his blood run cold. Luna was kneeling beside the bed, clutching her stomach as she vomited on the floor, her face pale and covered in sweat. Next to her, motionless and with eyes wide in pure shock, stood Tobias, frozen like a statue, staring at her with trembling hands. The scene seemed surreal, as if it were happening in slow motion. Theodore felt a rush of adrenaline take over his body as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Luna!" he shouted, running to her side. He held her by the shoulders, trying to help her steady herself. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Luna tried to speak, but all she managed were unintelligible mumbles before vomiting again. Theodore, desperate, looked to the side and saw Tobias, still paralyzed, his eyes filled with terror. Theodore looked at Luna, who was trembling on the floor, her face pale and drenched in sweat, as her hands struggled to brace herself on the bed. The sight of her, so fragile, only fueled his anger further. He turned back to Tobias, who was cornered against the wall, eyes wide and filled with tears. The boy looked so small in that moment, but Theodore couldn't see beyond the suspicion that consumed his mind. "What did you do to her, Tobias?" Theodore roared again, his voice echoing through the room. Each word carried a weight that seemed to crush the boy even more. "Why were you here? What did you put in her? Speak now." I didn't do anything, sir," Tobias screamed, his voice failing from sheer nervousness. He was trembling from head to toe, clenching his fists against his chest as if trying to protect himself. "I heard her moaning and thought she needed help. I swear, I didn't touch anything." Theodore took a threatening step forward, causing Tobias to shrink back even further. "You expect me to believe that? You showed up here out of nowhere, broke into my house, and now my wife is like this." "Hey, it's too much of a coincidence, Tobias. There's something you're not telling me." Tears streamed down Tobias's face as he shook his head desperately. "Please believe me, I didn't do anything. I just heard a noise and—" And she was already on the floor when I got here. I got scared. I just wanted to see if she was okay. But Theodore couldn't hear anything else. The fear of losing Luna and the possibility that something so sinister had happened under his roof blinded him. He pointed towards the door. "Get out of this room now before I drag you out," he shouted. But Tobias remained motionless, his knees trembling so violently he could barely stand. At that moment, Luna, mustering all the strength she could, raised her trembling hand and tried to get Theodore's attention. "Stop! He didn't do anything," she mumbled, her voice so faint it seemed to disappear into thin air. Theodore knelt beside her, trying to understand what she was saying, but the confusion in his mind prevented him from processing. "Luna, what happened? Talk to me," he begged, holding her face in his hands. But Luna merely shook her head slightly, as if trying to tell him to stop. Tobias took a small step forward, still afraid, but determined to help. "Sir, she needs a doctor. No matter what you think of me, she needs help now." Theodore quickly got up, pointing his finger at Tobias again. "You think you can tell me what to do? You're neck deep in this, and I won't forget. I'll find out what you did." As Theodore grabbed the phone to call an ambulance, the silence in the room seemed to turn into a suffocating weight. Tobias, still cowering against the wall, sobbed softly, feeling completely powerless. He looked at Luna, who was staring at him with eyes that seemed to be apologizing, but he couldn't understand why. Theodore hung up the phone and approached Luna again, holding her hand. "I'll sort this out, my love. I promise," he said. But the look he gave Tobias was one of pure contempt. Tobias, trembling, whispered, "I just wanted to help." The tension in the room was almost unbearable, and the distant sound of the ambulance sirens seemed even louder in Theodore's mind. He stared at Tobias one last time before muttering, full of rage, "If you've done anything to her, boy, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Soon after the ambulance sirens echoed down the street, the paramedics burst into the house quickly. Theodore, still agitated and visibly worried, gestured frantically towards the room. "She's in there." "Hurry," he shouted, his voice full of despair. They found Luna still on the floor, trying to catch her breath. Without wasting time, the rescuers stabilized her on a stretcher and took her outside the house, while Theodore remained by her side, holding her hand. "You'll be okay, my love. I'll be with you," he promised before turning to look at Tobias, who had stayed at the door, cowering and full of fear. Theodore hesitated for a moment. He wanted to accompany Luna in the ambulance, but he couldn't leave the boy without answers for what had just happened. With a furious look, he pointed at Tobias. "You stay here. Don't leave this house until I get back. I'll find out what you did." He turned and followed the ambulance until the vehicle left, but the anger and suspicion kept seething inside him. Minutes later, Theodore returned to the room, where he found Tobias sitting on the couch, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Theodore's expression was pure fury. He strode across the room with firm steps, the sound of his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Now you're going to tell me the truth," he said, his voice low and threatening. Tobias raised his head, his hands trembling as he tried to explain himself. I didn't do anything, sir, I swear," the boy began, his voice shaking. "I was sleeping in my room, and I heard noises coming from her room. They were like moans. It sounded like she was suffering, so I went out to see what was happening, and when I got there, she was already on the floor, vomiting." Theodore was unmoved. He narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, causing the boy to recoil on the couch. "You expect me to believe that? That you by chance heard noises in the middle of the night and decided to play the hero? I let you into my home, gave you food, a place to sleep, and you do this. You think you can lie to me?" "I'm not lying," Tobias shouted, tears streaming down his face again. "I just wanted to help. I got scared when I saw her like that, and I tried to see if she was okay." He sobbed between words, but Theodore seemed impenetrable, consumed by his own anger and fear. "Help?" Theodore responded sarcastically. "You think poisoning my wife is helping? I should have realized from the beginning. You came out of nowhere, a street kid, and I, like a fool, thought I could trust you. You're just like all the others, always wanting something in return." Theodore's words were like stabs to Tobias, who shook his head desperately. "I didn't do any of that, please believe me," he cried, almost breathless. "I just wanted her to be okay." I don't even know how to poison someone." Theodore scoffed, running his hand through his hair and pacing back and forth across the room, as if trying to organize his thoughts. But his anger seemed impossible to contain. He stopped abruptly and pointed his finger at Tobias again. "I have until dawn to prove to me you're telling the truth. If I find out you did anything to Luna, I'm handing you over to the police and you'll never see the light of day again. Understood?" Sobbing, Tobias nodded his head but said nothing more. He felt crushed, as if the weight of the entire world was upon him. Theodore left the room, slamming the door hard, leaving the boy alone, shaking with fear and heartbreak. As the silence returned to the house, Tobias curled up on the couch, hugging his knees. He didn't know how to prove his innocence, but he knew one thing. He hadn't done anything wrong, and now all he could do was hope that someone would believe him before it was too late. At the hospital, Theodore sat in the waiting room, restless and consumed by guilt and worry. The doctors had taken Luna for tests, and after what seemed like hours of waiting, one of them finally appeared. The doctor was a serious man, but his tone of voice brought calm. "Mr. Theodore," he began, as he reviewed the notes on his clipboard, "your wife is stable now. What happened was a case of food poisoning caused by something spoiled that she ate. It could have been poorly preserved or expired food, but there are no signs of poisoning." Theodore stood still for a moment, absorbing the doctor's words. "Spoiled food," he repeated, surprised. "So, it wasn't anything more serious?" "It wasn't." He trailed off, feeling a lump tighten in his throat as he remembered how he had treated Tobias. The doctor nodded, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions crossing Theodore's face. "That's right. She's recovering well and should rest for the next few days. Avoid heavy foods and make sure everything is fresh and well prepared." Theodore thanked the doctor and slowly walked to the room where Luna was resting. She was lying there, pale but breathing better. He gently held her hand, watching her face. Despite his concern, his mind was stuck on what had happened earlier. Tobias, the boy, the one he had accused without proof, the one who deep down only wanted to help. As he returned home, Theodore lost himself in his thoughts. Every word he had thrown at Tobias echoed in his mind. He relived the tears on the boy's face, his trembling voice desperately trying to explain himself. And now, with the truth before him, the guilt weighed even heavier. Tobias had done nothing wrong. He was just a child who had acted out of concern when he saw Luna feeling unwell. When Theodore arrived home, the house was silent. He found Tobias curled up on the couch, his eyes swollen from crying, clearly still terrified. The boy lifted his head as he heard the door open, but said nothing. He just looked at Theodore, waiting for the next blow, as if he was already accustomed to being treated with suspicion. Theodore stopped in the middle of the room and sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair. He knew he needed to make things right. "Tobias," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. I need to apologize." The boy blinked, surprised, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Theodore continued, "I was wrong. I let my anger and fear take over, and I accused you of something you didn't do. The doctor said Luna wasn't poisoned. It was spoiled food, something she probably ate at the Christmas dinner." Tobias stayed silent, still trying to process Theodore's words. The man took a step forward, looking directly into the boy's eyes. "I'm sorry for yelling at you, for accusing you unjustly. I should have trusted you, especially after everything you've been through. You just wanted to help, and I was a fool for not seeing that." Tears came back to Tobias's eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or sadness. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt and shook his head. I just wanted to help." "I would never hurt anyone," he said, his voice still trembling. Theodore knelt before the boy, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know that now," he said, "and I promise to do better. You don't deserve to be treated like that, Tobias. You deserve a home, care, and trust, and I want you to know that you will always be welcome here." The boy looked at Theodore, and for the first time he saw something different in his eyes, true remorse and the promise of a better future. He nodded, still speechless, but a small smile began to form on his lips. That night, as Tobias slept in the guest room, Theodore sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew he had a lot to learn, but he was determined to make his home a safe place for the boy who had entered his life so unexpectedly. Later that night, as Tobias and Theodore sat at the kitchen table, A lighter mood seemed to begin to form. Theodore was still trying to mend the trust he had broken with the boy, but Tobias, though a little more relaxed, still seemed pensive. After a few minutes of silence, the boy finally spoke, his voice low but laced with curiosity. "Mr. Theodore," he began, looking down at the table, hesitant. "The doctor said the spoiled food made your wife sick. Where did you buy that food?" Theodore frowned, reflecting for a moment. "I bought the ingredients for the Christmas dinner in a neighboring town," he replied, not realizing the weight of the question. "In fact, I got everything from the central restaurant in Sedona. I've always heard it's a good place to find fresh produce." At the mention of the town's name, Tobias froze. His breathing grew heavy, and his eyes widened in surprise. He lifted his head, staring at Theodore with a mixture of disbelief and unease. "Sedona?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Are you sure?" Theodore nodded, confused by the boy's reaction. "Yes. Why does that matter? It's a busy place with lots of merchants. One of them even recommended a restaurant in the same town to me. I think the name was Martin's Restaurant. I remember the owner waited on me personally. Seemed like a rather rude fellow, to be honest, but efficient." The name hit Tobias like a punch in the gut. He felt a chill run up his spine as painful memories flooded his mind. "Martin," he repeated, almost unable to believe it. I didn't know his name, but that's the man who humiliated me. He's the owner of that restaurant where I was hiding." Theodore's eyes widened in surprise at the revelation. "You know him?" he asked, leaning forward. "You were at that restaurant? What happened there?" Tobias took a deep breath, trying to organize the words in his mind. The pain of the memories was still vivid, but he felt he needed to tell. "I was hiding in the storage room of that restaurant for a few days," he began, his voice trembling. "A kind man named John helped me. He was a janitor there and gave me food, let me rest, but the owner, Mr. Martin, he found me. He yelled at me, called me worthless, and said I was nothing." Theodore listened in silence, his fists clenched as anger began to grow. Tobias continued, his eyes now brimming with tears. "John tried to defend me, but the owner got even angrier. He threatened to fire John if he kept helping me. And then, John had an attack. He fell to the floor right in front of him. And you know what he did? He just stood there. He didn't care. He only called an ambulance because he didn't want me to cause any more trouble." Theodore shook his head in disbelief. "And John? Did he survive?" Tobias closed his eyes, clenching his fists. "No, he died. And Mr. Martin didn't care. He just threw me out of the restaurant, hurting me like I was trash." The tears were now streaming down the boy's face as he looked at Theodore with a mixture of pain and hope. "That man. He was responsible for one of the worst things that ever happened to me. And now he was the one who sold the food that made your wife sick." Theodore leaned back in his chair, his face serious and his eyes fixed on the boy. He felt anger burning in his chest, not only for what had happened to Luna, but also for the suffering Tobias had endured at the hands of such a cruel man. He remained silent for a few moments, trying to absorb everything he had just heard. "I didn't know about this, Tobias," Theodore said finally. His voice was low but laced with determination. "I'm sorry you had to go through something so terrible, but now we know who this man is, and I won't let him keep doing this to anyone." Tobias looked at him, still uncertain, but Theodore's words brought a flicker of hope to his heart. Maybe, for the first time, he wasn't alone in this fight. Theodore felt his blood boil as he listened to every word from Tobias. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to control the rage that rose like an overwhelming wave. The idea that a man like Martin, the owner of a restaurant, had not only treated Tobias with disdain, but also ignored John's death, left him distraught. The fact that Luna had fallen ill because of something from that place only made it all worse. "This will not stay like this," said Theodore, abruptly getting up. His voice was grave, and his face, once calm, now carried a somber expression. He looked at Tobias, who was still sitting on the chair, visibly tense. "Let's go there. I want to see with my own eyes who this man is and how he still has the courage to treat people this way." "Mr. Theodore, Tobias hesitated, the idea of going back to that place making his breath quicken. "What if he recognizes me? He'll send me away again, or worse." Theodore crouched down, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Oh, you're not alone this time, Tobias. I'll go with you, and I promise he won't touch you. Now let's go." Reluctantly, Tobias nodded, even with the evident fear on his face. The two left the house quickly and got into Theodore's car. The journey to the neighboring town seemed longer than ever for the boy, who huddled in the passenger seat, hugging his knees. Theodore drove in silence, his mind working on every detail of what he would say to this Martin when he met him. When they finally arrived at the entrance to Sedona, Theodore parked the car on a street near the restaurant. He took a deep breath, looking at the large illuminated sign that read, "Martin's Restaurant." Tobias looked out the window, and the mere glimpse of the place made his stomach churn. Theodore turned off the engine and turned to Tobias. "I want you to go ahead," he said in a calmer tone. "Go in and see if he's still there. Stay near the entrance, I just want to know how he acts. I'll meet you in a few minutes, I need to check a problem with the car." Tobias widened his eyes, fear showing on his expression. I don't know if I can," he muttered, his voice almost gone. "You can do it," Theodore stated firmly. "Trust me, I'm right here. He won't do anything to you while I'm around." The boy took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he could find. He slowly opened the car door and stepped out, feeling the cold night air hit his face. Each step towards the restaurant felt heavier, and fear gripped his chest like an invisible hand. He looked back once, seeing Theodore standing beside the car, motioning for him to go on. Tobias swallowed hard and, with his heart beating like a drum, approached the restaurant entrance. The sign glowed above him, and the muffled sound of voices and cutlery could be heard from inside. With trembling hands, he slowly pushed the door and entered. As soon as Tobias pushed the restaurant door open, the smell of hot food invaded his nostrils, but the atmosphere brought him no comfort. The place was full of people talking and laughing, but to him, everything seemed intimidating. Walking slowly with his head down, he tried to go unnoticed. His hands were shaking and each step felt heavier than the last. When he finally neared the counter, Martin's rough, loud voice made him freeze. The restaurant owner was behind the counter, shouting orders at the staff. But when he spotted Tobias, his expression instantly changed to a mixture of contempt and anger. "You again?" Martin shouted, advancing from behind the counter with quick, determined steps. His voice echoed through the restaurant, drawing the attention of some patrons. "What do you think you're doing here? Didn't I make it clear last time that you're not welcome?" Tobias tried to open his mouth to respond, but Martin's threatening tone made him recoil. "Trying to steal food again, aren't you? Brats like you think the world owes you something, but you're nothing but dead weight." Tobias felt his face burn with shame, but he tried to argue, his voice coming out weak and hesitant. I'm not here to steal. His words were cut off when Martin let out a cruel laugh, drawing curious looks and murmurs from the patrons. "Shut up," the owner interrupted, pointing his finger directly at the boy's face. "You think anyone here believes you? Look at yourself. You have nothing, you are nothing. You just want to get in my way like last time." Martin advanced further, and Tobias backed up against the wall, trying to get as far away as possible. "And you know what? If I see you here again, I won't be so nice. I'll call the cops and you'll end up behind bars where scum like you belongs." Martin's tone was full of hatred, his words laced with cruelty. Tobias felt his heart racing, and tears began to well up in his eyes, but he held them back with all his might. Showing weakness would only increase the man's contempt. "You must think you have some kind of chance here, don't you? But you don't. Nobody cares about you. Not even that scumbag John who thought he could defy me for your sake." At the mention of John's name, Tobias looked up, surprised and confused. Martin noticed the boy's reaction and continued, a cruel smile appearing on his face. "Oh, you remember him, don't you? That useless fool who got himself into trouble because he tried to help you. And look where he is now, dead. Dying like an idiot, because he thought people like you were worth something." The words cut through Tobias like knives. He felt tears silently stream down his face as Martin laughed again. The man crossed his arms, looking at the boy with contempt. "John died because he was weak, and brats like you don't have a place in this world. I didn't cry for him, and nobody should cry for you. Now get out of here before I drag you out myself." As Martin continued his cruel tirade, the restaurant door burst open, slamming against the wall. Everyone in the room turned, including Martin, who abruptly stopped speaking. In the doorway, Theodore stood, his expression serious and menacing, as his eyes scanned the room until they found Martin and Tobias. The restaurant door burst open, slamming against the wall and interrupting Martin's cruel words. All eyes turned toward the entrance where Theodore stood, his imposing figure illuminated by the dining room lights. His expression was grim, and his eyes were fixed on Martin and Tobias, who remained cowering against the wall. Without uttering a word, Theodore strode forward with firm steps, the tension in the air growing with each stride. When he finally reached them, Theodore stood in front of Martin, his posture rigid and his piercing gaze commanding an authority that made the restaurant owner instinctively recoil. "I heard everything you said," Theodore began, his voice low but charged with power. "And let me tell you something. Don't you dare speak to that boy like that again. Who do you think you are to humiliate a child like that?" Martin froze for a moment, trying to find words, but Theodore didn't give him room to respond. He took a step forward, moving so close that the restaurant owner had to lean back. "You think you can treat people like garbage just because you're in charge here? You think that makes you powerful? Well, let me tell you, it only shows how small and miserable you really are." Tobias, who observed everything with wide eyes, felt a mixture of relief and admiration upon hearing Theodore's words. For the first time, someone was by his side, facing Martin and putting him in his place. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, with customers and employees watching the scene without daring to interfere. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Martin finally tried to react. I didn't know he was accompanied," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he took a step back. Well, sir, I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just keeping order in my establishment." Theodore narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms. "Keeping order? Is that what you call it? Humiliating, threatening, and disrespecting someone who has clearly suffered enough? You think that's keeping order?" Martin began to sweat, realizing he had lost control of the situation. His posture instantly changed, and he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir, please understand, this place is busy, and sometimes things get out of hand. But you see, I've always had the utmost respect for my customers and the community." Theodore let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, of course, respect for the community. It was out of respect that you ignored what happened to John, wasn't it? Or that you threatened this boy with the police while he was just trying to survive. Spare me your hypocrisy, Martin. You don't respect anyone but yourself." Upon hearing John's name, Martin turned pale. He looked around as if seeking support, but the looks from customers and employees only increased his discomfort. John was a good employee, of course, but he made his own decisions, he said, trying to justify his stance. "And I had no way of predicting what would happen. It was a tragedy, but you didn't care," Theodore interrupted, his voice cutting. "You discarded him as if he was nothing, just as you tried to do with Tobias. But guess what? You're not going to do that anymore because now he's not alone." Martin, realizing his usual authoritative attitude wouldn't work with Theodore, changed tactics. His tone became subservient, and he began to desperately suck up to Theodore. "Sir, you see, I didn't know the boy was with you. If I had known, I would have handled everything differently. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I respect people like you very much, you know, who are successful and help others. Please accept my apologies for the misunderstanding." Theodore took a step back, crossing his arms as he looked Martin up and down. His contempt for the man was evident, and he didn't try to hide it. "Are you apologizing to me or to him?" he asked, pointing at Tobias, who was still watching everything in silence, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Martin was speechless for a moment, but he forced a smile before turning to Tobias. "Of course, I also apologize to the boy. It wasn't my intention. Well, I was just trying to protect my business, but I see now that I may have been, say, a bit harsh." Theodore shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "You know, Martin, empty apologies don't fix anything. If you really want to make things right, start by changing the way you treat people. Because if I hear about you humiliating someone again, you'll wish you'd never met me." Martin swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. That will never happen again." Theodore took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the anger in his voice was impossible to hide. He looked directly into Martin's eyes, who was now avoiding eye contact. "Oh, and there's one more thing," Theodore began, his voice cutting. "The food you sold at your restaurant, The same one I bought for the Christmas dinner was spoiled. It put my wife in the hospital." Martin raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise, but Theodore didn't believe him for a moment. "I want my money back," he said, crossing his arms, "and I'm talking about every penny. You think you can sell low-quality products, make people sick, and get away with it? I'm not going to let that happen." Martin's posture changed immediately. He shed his earlier nervousness and let his arrogant side show. "Sir, with all due respect, the food that comes out of here is always high quality. If something happened, it's not my responsibility. Maybe you stored the ingredients improperly or, I don't know, went overboard with their use. I can't control what happens after the food leaves here." Theodore took a step forward, pointing his finger in Martin's face. "You're implying it was my fault? I spent a fortune here. I trusted I was buying the best for my family, and you're saying that's my problem. No, that's your problem, and you're going to give back every penny right now." Martin shook his head, crossing his arms. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's not going to happen. Sales are final and we don't offer refunds, especially when we're talking about an order as big as yours. I'm not making exceptions, even for someone like you." The tension in the air was palpable, and the customers around began to whisper among themselves, watching the argument. Theodore felt the anger growing with every second, but before he could respond, he noticed Tobias clutching his stomach and bending slightly. The boy was pale, with sweat dripping down his face, and his breathing seemed heavier than normal. "Tobias?" Theodore called, concern taking over his face. He crouched down next to the boy, who was now trembling and looked like he was about to collapse. "Are you okay? What's going on?" I don't know," Tobias whispered, his voice weak. "My stomach hurts so much." The discussion with Martin was immediately forgotten. Theodore rose quickly, putting an arm around Tobias to support him. "He needs a doctor now," he said firmly. Without looking at Martin again, Theodore guided Tobias out of the restaurant, leaving the owner behind, surprised and relieved at not having to deal with the situation any longer. Theodore put Tobias in the car and accelerated toward the nearest hospital. The boy was huddled in the passenger seat, his hands pressing his stomach as he moaned softly. Theodore couldn't hide his concern as he drove. "Hold on, Tobias. I'm here. We'll get to the hospital in a few minutes, I promise." When they arrived at the hospital, Theodore carried Tobias in his arms, striding across the reception with hurried steps and a desperate expression that drew everyone's attention. "He's feeling sick, please help him," he exclaimed, looking straight at the receptionist. The woman quickly summoned a medical team, who appeared within minutes with a stretcher. Theodore carefully laid Tobias on it, watching the boy moan softly, his face pale and covered in sweat. As the doctors took him into an emergency room, Theodore stood still for a few seconds, his arms hanging by his sides, feeling helpless. Then he started pacing back and forth in the waiting room, his thoughts in turmoil. "This is my fault," he muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I should have been more careful. He's been through so much, and I put him in a situation that only made everything worse. Every minute that passed seemed like an eternity." He remembered Martin's words, the cruel tone, and the look of contempt he directed at Tobias. He also thought about the difficulties the boy had faced before crossing his path. How could someone so young carry so much pain? Theodore felt the weight of his responsibility, but now all he could do was wait and hope that the boy would be okay. Finally, after nearly an hour, a doctor appeared. Theodore stepped forward quickly, almost tripping over his own feet. "How is he? Is he going to be all right?" he asked, the urgency spilling over in his voice. The doctor nodded, his tone reassuring. "He's stable now. It was a combination of extreme stress and lack of proper nutrition. He's dehydrated and showing signs of severe exhaustion. He needs rest, good food, and care. With that, he should make a full recovery." Theodore let out a deep sigh, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment they arrived at the hospital. "Can I see him?" he asked, and the doctor nodded before leading him to the room where Tobias was resting. As he entered the room, Theodore felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Tobias was lying in a clean bed with a blanket pulled up to his chest. The boy looked so small and fragile, but there was a glimmer of life in his eyes as he slowly turned his head to look at Theodore. "Mr. Theodore," Tobias murmured, his voice weak but laden with emotion. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Theodore pulled a chair and sat beside the bed, taking Tobias's small hand in his own. "Don't say that, Tobias," he replied, his voice full of compassion. "You have nothing to apologize for. It's me who should be apologizing. I put you in that situation with Martin. I never should have taken you there. That was my mistake, not yours." Tobias's eyes filled with tears, but he was too exhausted to cry. He just nodded, giving Theodore's hand a gentle squeeze. I just wanted to be helpful. I didn't want to ruin anything," he said, with a small sob. Theodore felt a lump tighten in his throat. "You didn't ruin anything, Tobias," he said, leaning forward. "In fact, you are the bravest person I've ever met. You've faced more things than any child should have to face, and I promise you, I will never let anyone hurt you again." As Tobias drifted off to sleep, the silence of the room was filled with the soft sound of his breathing. Theodore remained seated beside him, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about Luna, who was still recovering, and John, whose kindness had been brushed off by someone like Martin. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could do something about the future. Tobias wouldn't be alone anymore. He would make sure the boy had everything he needed, not just to survive but to thrive. As he looked at Tobias's weary face, Theodore made a silent promise. He would fight anyone who tried to take the little that boy had. And more than that, he would ensure Tobias had a future filled with love, safety, and opportunity. When Theodore returned to Martin's restaurant the following day, something seemed different. The facade was lit up in an exaggerated way, as if trying to draw even more attention. However, what caught his eye immediately were the several security guards posted outside. Burly men dressed in black suits were spread out around the entrance and sides of the establishment, eyeing everyone who passed with suspicious looks. Theodore parked the car a few meters away and got out, feeling his blood boil as he walked toward the entrance. He was already prepared to confront Martin again, but the sight of the guards reinforced his anger. As he tried to enter the restaurant, one of the men approached, blocking his path. "Can I help you, sir?" the security guard asked with a stern expression. Theodore raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "I'm here to speak with Martin. Tell him Theodore Pierce is here, and I'm not leaving until he sees me." The guard hesitated for a moment, but seeing the determination in Theodore's eyes, he stepped back and went inside to relay the message. A few minutes later, Martin appeared at the door, followed by two more guards with a forced smile on his face. "Ah, Mr. Theodore," Martin said, opening his arms in an exaggerated gesture. "What a surprise to see you again. I hope you had a good night, despite yesterday's events." Theodore took a step forward, ignoring the guards trying to intimidate him. "Good night?" he responded, his voice laced with irony. "My wife fell ill. A boy nearly died of exhaustion, and you think that's what I would call a good night?" Martin raised his hands as if trying to avoid a confrontation. "Look, Mr. Theodore, I'm just trying to protect my business. After yesterday, I realized I needed to take steps to ensure the safety of the restaurant. I can't risk any more. Issues, you understand?" Theodore let out a dry laugh, crossing his arms. "Safety? Is that what you call filling the place with security guards? Cowardice would be a better word. You're not trying to protect anything but your own ego. You're afraid people will find out what kind of man you truly are." Martin's fake smile disappeared, and he pursed his lips. "I own a business, Mr. Theodore, and like any business owner, I do what's necessary to keep it running. If that means putting security guards to avoid unwanted disruptions, then so be it." Theodore took another step forward, stopping just a few centimeters away from Martin, ignoring the uneasy security guards moving around them. "You know what's funny, Martin? Yesterday you didn't care one bit about the safety of a starving boy or the well-being of an employee like John. But now, suddenly, you're worried about security. That's not protection, that's fear. Fear that someone will finally hold you accountable for all your petty and cowardly actions." Martin swallowed hard, but tried to maintain his composure. "I'm sorry if you've had a bad experience here, but I won't tolerate being disrespected in my own establishment," he said, attempting a firm tone that failed to hide his insecurity. "If you have nothing constructive to say, I suggest you leave." Theodore looked around, observing the security guards, the employees peeking from afar, and even some customers who remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He turned his eyes back to Martin, his voice low but full of authority. "I'm not here to be constructive, Martin. I'm here to tell you that your cowardice is as obvious as your lack of character. And if you think these security guards will protect you from the truth, you're mistaken. Because the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how many people you put at the door." Martin fell silent, clenching his fists but lacking the courage to respond. Theodore shook his head in disdain, turned around and started walking back to his car, but not before throwing one last remark over his shoulder. "Keep acting like this, Martin, and one day even your security guards will abandon you." As he walked away, Theodore could feel everyone's eyes following him, but he didn't care. He knew he had planted the seed of doubt in Martin's mind, and although the confrontation hadn't solved everything, it was a step in the right direction to expose the true character of the man hiding behind security guards and empty promises. As Theodore moved away from Martin's restaurant, the sound of sirens broke the silence of the street. He turned in time to see 2 police cars pulling up in front of the establishment. The officers quickly got out, their expressions serious, and started entering the restaurant. Theodore stood still for a moment, watching as customers and employees stepped aside, confused and curious. Martin, who was still near the entrance, widened his eyes when he saw the police officers. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was evident he was nervous. "What's going on here?" he asked, trying to sound indignant, but his voice trembled slightly. One of the officers approached, showing an official document. "We've received reports of illegal practices in your restaurant, including the sale of unfit food for consumption and mistreatment of employees and customers. We have a warrant to investigate the premises and bring you in for questioning." Martin began to sweat, his expression alternating between anger and panic. "This is an outrage. I'm a reputable businessman. Who made these reports? Is this some kind of setup?" he protested. But the officers had already started searching the restaurant while one of them held him firmly by the arm. Theodore watched from a distance, his arms crossed. He knew justice was finally catching up to Martin, but he didn't feel satisfied. The image of Tobias and his wife, Luna, still weighed heavily on his mind. He had more important things to resolve than witnessing the downfall of a man like Martin. As he pondered, the phone in his pocket started vibrating. He quickly picked it up, seeing it was a call from the hospital. Theodore's heart raced, and he answered immediately. "Hello? Mr. Theodore Pierce?" asked a voice on the other end. "This is the hospital. We need to inform you that both your wife and the boy, Tobias, have developed complications. They are under observation, but the situation requires immediate attention." Theodore felt a lump in his throat. "Both of them? What's going on? Are they going to be okay?" he asked, his voice laden with concern. "We're doing everything we can, sir," the doctor replied, "but it's important that you come to the hospital as soon as possible." He hung up the call, the phone trembling in his hand. For a moment he stood motionless, unable to process the situation. His wife, Luna, was in the hospital, the woman with whom he had shared years of life. And Tobias, the boy he had promised to protect, was equally in danger. Theodore's mind was divided. He looked at the car, feeling the weight of the decision he needed to make. "Luna needs me," he whispered to himself, trying to convince himself. But at the same time, the image of Tobias appeared in his mind. The boy had been through so much and yet still trusted him. How could he abandon him now? Finally, Theodore took a deep breath, clenching his fists. He had made his decision. He got into the car, started the engine, and drove towards the hospital. His choice was clear. He would go where his heart told him he was most needed at that moment, and that place was by Tobias's side. As he drove, Theodore felt a mixture of guilt and determination. He knew Luna would understand. She had always been strong and understanding, and more importantly, she was not alone. But Tobias, on the other hand, had no one. He needed someone by his side now, someone to show him he was not alone in the world. Theodore gripped the steering wheel, accelerating, determined to keep the promise he had made to the boy. When he arrived at the hospital, Theodore was led down the white, cold corridors, where the sound of shoes echoed like the constant ticking of a clock. He was anxious, with his heart pounding and his hands trembling. As soon as he reached the indicated floor, he saw a doctor leaving one of the rooms. Approaching hastily, he almost tripped over his own feet. "Doctor, how are they? My wife? And the boy?" His voice was choked with the concern that had consumed him since he received the news. The doctor, with a calm expression, placed a firm hand on Theodore's shoulder, trying to calm him. "They're both fine, Mr. Theodore. The situation was delicate, but we managed to stabilize them. Your wife suffered a mild relapse due to the intoxication, but she is responding well to treatment. As for the boy, he was very dehydrated and exhausted, but he's out of danger now. With some rest and care, they should both make a full recovery." Theodore let out a deep sigh, feeling the weight on his chest lessen. The anguish that had accompanied him throughout the journey was finally giving way to relief. "Can I see them? I want to make sure they're okay." His tone was firm, but his gaze betrayed the fatigue of hours of uninterrupted worry. He needed to be by their side to make sure they were truly out of danger. "Of course," the doctor replied, nodding toward the hallway. "They still need rest, but they can receive visitors. Your presence will be important for both of them." With those words, the doctor walked away, leaving Theodore to make his way to Tobias's room. He paused for a moment in front of the door, taking a deep breath before entering. When he opened the door, he saw Tobias sitting on the bed holding a cup of water in his small hands. The boy, still pale, smiled shyly when he saw him. "Mr. Theodore," Tobias said, his voice weak but filled with emotion. I thought you wouldn't come." He averted his gaze as if fearing that Theodore might abandon him as so many others had done before. His fragility was evident, but his eyes had a spark of hope that Theodore couldn't ignore. Theodore approached the bed and sat down next to the boy, holding his hand firmly. "Tobias, how could you think that?" he said, with a gentle seriousness in his voice. "I would never leave you alone. You're important to me, and I promised I would take care of you. Nothing in the world will make me break that promise." He squeezed the boy's hand, who looked at him with tear-filled eyes. I just didn't want to cause any trouble," Tobias murmured, lowering his gaze to the sheet. "The doctors were nice to me, but I thought you might be angry because of everything that happened." He took a deep breath, trying to hold back his tears, but Theodore noticed the vulnerability in his voice. Theodore shook his head, squeezing Tobias's hand even tighter. "Never think that, Tobias. None of this was your fault. If anyone made a mistake here, it was me for not protecting you enough. But I'm here now, and I'll make sure you have everything you need. From now on, your health and happiness come first." After spending some time by Tobias's side, assuring him that everything would be okay, Theodore went to his wife Luna's room. He paused for a moment at the door, watching her lying in the bed, a soft smile on her face. Despite her weakness, she seemed radiant when she saw him enter. "You came," she said, her voice still weak but filled with affection and relief. Her eyes met Theodore's, and she tried to sit up, but he quickly approached to hold her back. "Of course I came," he replied, holding her hand and leaning in to gently kiss her forehead. "You're everything to me, Luna. I was so worried. I couldn't think of anything but being here by your side." His voice trembled, and he gently squeezed her hand as if he wanted to convey all the strength she would need to recover. Luna shook her head, trying to reassure him. "I'll be fine, Theodore. It was just a relapse. Nothing serious. The doctors said there's nothing to worry about. You've already done so much for me, as you always do. Now take care of yourself too." Her voice was soft but filled with love, and she looked at him with gratitude. Theodore felt his eyes water, but he smiled to hide the emotion. He knew his wife had always been strong and understanding, and at that moment, he felt even more proud of her. "You don't need to worry about me, Luna. My priority is you and Tobias. You two are my family now, and I won't let anything happen to you." The two spent time together, conversing and exchanging words of comfort. Theodore divided his attention between the two rooms, making sure they were both being well taken care of. Tobias, who had begun to improve rapidly, showed more energy with every passing hour. Luna, although still resting, appeared confident that she would soon be fully recovered. And Theodore, now free from the weight of guilt, felt a new determination growing within him. As night fell, he felt grateful to have managed to be there for both of them, and for the opportunity to rebuild their lives together. Luna and Tobias were recovering, and that was all he needed to move forward, knowing that the future, despite the challenges, was full of hope. The sun rose bright that morning, spreading its golden light through the hospital windows. Theodore, seated between Luna and Tobias's rooms, felt a sense of peace for the first time in days. Both were recovering well, and the anxiety that had consumed him in recent days was giving way to hope. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but finally, there was a feeling that things were heading towards something better. Entering Tobias's room, Theodore found the boy sitting up in bed, eating a breakfast tray that the doctor had approved. Although still pale, Tobias had a sparkle in his eyes that Theodore hadn't seen in a long time. "Good morning, champ," said Theodore, pulling up a chair to sit by his side. "How are you feeling today?" Tobias looked up, smiling shyly. "Better. The food is good, and it doesn't hurt as much anymore." He paused, holding the fork carefully. "Mr. Theodore, thank you for everything. I know that. Maybe I was a handful, but you've always been here." Theodore placed a comforting hand on Tobias's shoulder. "Don't talk like that, Tobias. You're part of my family now, and family looks out for each other. No matter what happens, I'll always be by your side." Tobias's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. Instead, he nodded, feeling something he had rarely experienced: security. For someone who had grown up with no one to trust, those words from Theodore were more valuable than any gift. After making sure Tobias was comfortable, Theodore went to Luna's room. His wife, still resting, was sitting up in bed reading a book a nurse had lent her. When she saw Theodore enter, she smiled, her face lit up with happiness to see him. "You look tired," she said softly, closing the book and reaching out to him. Theodore took her hand, sitting down beside the bed. "A little," he admitted, "but I'm relieved to see you two doing well. Tobias is already eating and smiling, and you're here, strong as ever. That's all that matters to me." Luna stroked Theodore's face tenderly. "You've done so much, Theodore. I heard everything that happened, and I know it wasn't easy. But what you did for that boy, it's something incredible. He needed someone like you, and you showed up." Theodore smiled, but there was something more to his expression. "I did what needed to be done, Luna, but now I want to do more. I want to give him a real home. Not just a place for him to sleep, but a place where he feels loved and safe." Luna nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I want that too. He's already part of our family, Theodore. Let's give him the future he deserves." A few days later, Luna and Tobias were discharged from the hospital, and Theodore took them home. Along the way, Tobias looked out the car window, marveling at the trees decorated with Christmas lights and families gathered on the streets. "It's so beautiful," he murmured, as his eyes sparkled with the magic of the season. Theodore glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled. "You haven't seen anything yet, Tobias. Wait until we get home." Luna, sitting beside Theodore, exchanged a knowing look with him, aware that something special was waiting for Tobias. When they arrived, Tobias was awestruck at the sight of the house decorated with twinkling lights and a tall, majestic Christmas tree in the living room. There were presents under the tree, carefully wrapped, and a delicious aroma of freshly baked cookies in the air. "All this is for me too?" he asked, incredulous. Luna crouched down to be at his height, holding his hands. "All of this is for us, Tobias, because we are a family now, and this house is yours too." Tobias couldn't hold back the tears this time. He ran to hug Luna and then Theodore, feeling truly welcomed for the first time in his life. In the months that followed, Theodore, Luna, and Tobias's life transformed completely. Theodore, determined to make a difference, began investing in social projects to help children living on the streets. He turned part of his business into a foundation that offered shelter, food, and education for underprivileged youth. Inspired by his experience with Tobias, he knew that many other children needed support and promised to be a positive force in their lives. Luna, always by his side, was actively involved in the foundation's administration, while also dedicating time to create a loving environment at home. Tobias, in turn, started attending the local school and quickly made friends. He stood out for his curiosity and determination, characteristics that Theodore and Luna encouraged every day. "You're going to do great things, Tobias," Theodore said one night while helping the boy with his homework. "I believe in you, and I want you to know that you can be whatever you want. Nothing in this world is impossible." Tobias smiled, holding the pencil with more confidence. "I want to be like you, Mr. Theodore. I want to help people like you helped me." The following year, Christmas arrived again, but this time it was different. Theodore and Luna's house was full of laughter, music, and friends. Tobias, now healthier and more confident, helped Luna decorate the Christmas tree, while Theodore set the table for dinner. The boy seemed to have grown, not just in height, but in happiness and security. When night fell, Theodore's house was permeated by the aroma of Christmas dishes and filled with a welcoming atmosphere that seemed to embrace everyone present. The meticulously decorated table with candles, flowers, and Christmas ornaments was the centerpiece of the room. Luna adjusted the last details with a smile on her face, while Tobias watched in delight, feeling part of that moment in a full and true way. It was something he had never imagined experiencing, being surrounded by love and human warmth. Theodore stood up from his chair, holding a glass of wine in one hand and extending the other to touch Tobias's shoulder. "Before we start this dinner," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion, "I would like to make a toast." He looked at Luna and then at Tobias, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and happiness. "This year has been full of challenges, but also many blessings. We are here, together, as a family, and that's all that matters. I want to thank you, Luna and Tobias, for teaching me the true meaning of love and resilience." Theodore's words echoed through the room, filling Luna's heart with pride and Tobias's with an emotion so great that he could barely hold back his tears. The boy looked at him, his eyes reflecting the glow of the Christmas tree lights in the background. "I'm the one who has to thank you," Tobias replied, his voice trembling but full of sincerity. "You gave me everything I never thought I would have. A home, love, and hope. I will never forget that." Luna, emotional, held Theodore's hand and Tobias's at the same time, forming a circle. "And I want to say that I'm grateful that we found each other. Tobias, you brought a new glow to our home, an energy that made us reborn. And Theodore, you proved that love and kindness can transform lives. I love you both, and this is the best Christmas present I could ask for." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was a silence full of meaning, where words were not needed because the love that united the three was clear in every gesture, in every look. Theodore raised his glass, and Luna and Tobias joined him. "To a future full of love, unity, and new beginnings," he declared. As they toasted, the soft sound of clinking glasses mingled with the laughter coming from the room. Tobias, for the first time, felt he was exactly where he should be. He looked at the plates on the table full of delicious foods, but realized that the greatest gift was being there, with people who truly loved him. After dinner, Theodore surprised Tobias with a special present. He handed him a large, colorful package with a golden bow on top. "This is for you," he said with a warm smile. Tobias took the present, surprised, and began to carefully unwrap it. Inside, he found a brand new bicycle, something he had always dreamed of but never thought he would have. "Is it really mine?" he asked, incredulous, looking at Theodore and Luna, who nodded with broad smiles. Tobias ran to hug them both at the same time, tears of joy running down his face. Thank you, I promise I'll take very good care of it." Luna ran her hand through the boy's hair, laughing softly. "You deserve it, Tobias. And this is just the beginning. Many good things are yet to come. If you enjoyed this story, take the opportunity to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing exciting stories to you almost every day. Stay tuned, because a new surprising narrative is on its way. We are very grateful for your presence here. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on your screen to check out a special selection made especially for you, full of unforgettable stories and guaranteed fun. Until then.